Singularity. My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by either writing a brief review on iTunes or by simply becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. Today, my guest on the show is Professor Steve Fuller. Professor Fuller is the author of at least 25 books, including a trilogy relating to the idea of the post or transhuman future. And most recently, his upcoming book is called Nietzschean Meditations, Untimely Thoughts at the Dawn of the Transhuman Age. So, Professor Steve Fuller, welcome to Singularity FM.
Well, thank you, Nicola, for having me.
Fantastic. I've been looking forward to our conversation because you seem to have a very kind of extensive, voluminous knowledge into the sort of philosophy of science and the sort of the history of ideas and how they go from one age into another. And with a particularly interesting focus in the last decade or maybe decade and a half on transhumanism. So that's all very relevant, not only to my audience and me personally, but also I believe to the time that we live in today. So if I were to ask you to simply introduce yourself in a sentence or two to those of our viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with Steve Fuller, who is Professor Fuller?
Okay, well, first of all, my training, original training, is in history and philosophy of science, and in a way that gives you a sense of kind of where I'm naturally coming from, which you've already kind of indicated. But over the course of my career, I've developed this field called social epistemology, and that's the thing I'm probably best known for, because I really only started to write seriously about transhumanism, I would say maybe, 10 to 15 years ago, not really much before that, but already in the 1980s, I was known for this thing in social epistemology, which is about the social foundations of knowledge, understood both empirically and normatively. And what that means is I'm interested in the way in which knowledge has developed historically and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I'm also have an eye toward what's the best way to organize knowledge. Okay, who should be the producers of knowledge? What should they know? How should knowledge be distributed? All that kind of stuff. And that is kind of my own research field. And so, as you indicated, for the last 10, 15 years, I've been working very much specifically on transhumanism as part of a kind of general perspective that I have on these matters, which is that science and technology have been the primary means by which human beings have changed themselves. And when I say change themselves, I also mean in a very fundamental way redefine themselves. And in a sense, transhumanism is the latest continuation of that project, which I would say is associated with the European Enlightenment, let's say in the early modern era. So in other words, this is a mode of thinking that is by no means brand new. I mean, what's brand new or what's newer is the kind of technology side of it. Of course, that's new. But in terms of the kinds of ideas that are animating it, especially a lot of the ideas that people often think of as being science fictional, are in fact very deeply rooted in the history of Western culture.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, as a little side note, I love people who are buried in books, and you literally you literally look like you're buried in books. If I had like the best sort of environment, it would be something like your office right now, at least for a part of the day. Maybe not, because I also love nature, but I love books.
Well, dying species. I have to say, I'm pretty much the only person in my department, and probably one of the few in the university, even though I'm in a pretty distinguished university, that would actually have an office that looks like this.
Yeah, and the new generation, I don't know what it is about books, but especially if it's a book I want to keep, I always prefer to have the hard copy. I have the digital copy quite often too, but there's something about holding the book and underlining some passages with a marker like I used to do 25 years ago or something, and then just going back and flipping through the pages and having it in my hand. I don't know.
Well, I do think, there is a point there, because I do think in terms of spatial memory, right, the way in which knowledge gets codified, right? So, like, you read these books, and very often you associate the ideas with where you found them in the book, what page, what part of the page even. And it seems to be that kind of spatial memory, which has been historically very important for codifying knowledge, including things like writing marginal comments, right, in the books. All of that is kind of disappearing now, right? Because with the digital stuff, people don't relate to the text quite in the same way anymore. It loses kind of its spatiality.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But let me go back to you again.
Okay.
Are you a sociologist then? Are you a sort of a philosopher with a focus on epistemology, perhaps? Because that's what it looks like to me as a potential.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think another thing about my career, which I think is pretty evident to people who read my stuff, is I'm very interdisciplinary, right? So that, and this has been true from the very beginning, in that all of my degrees were interdisciplinary. So I have a degree in history and sociology. I have 2 degrees in history and philosophy of science, and so I've ranged very widely generally. And the reason why I would say I'm in a sociology department now and have been for the last quarter century, which is maybe 2/3 of my professional career, is because in Britain, where I'm living, sociology is a fairly porous subject, you might say. People from lots of different fields get into it, right? It's not quite as professionalized, you might say, as sociology is, let's say, in the United States. And so if I were to move from Britain, let's say, and go back to the United States, which is where I'm from originally, I doubt that I would actually be going back to a sociology department. You see? So sociology, though, is a very good environment for me in this country.
That's very interesting. And by the way, tell us a little bit about sort of your journey from the US to the UK. Which part of the US are you from?
I'm originally from New York City, but I actually, and I went to Columbia University, which is in New York City, with the Ivy League school in New York. And then when I left there, I won this university fellowship from Columbia to study at Cambridge. Okay, so this was 1979, and I did my master's degree there. And I was only there for 2 years at the time, and I came back to the United States, and I did my PhD in history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. And then I, was working in the United States from the mid '80s until the early 1990s, and then I was invited to apply for the open chair in sociology at the University of Durham in England, and that's when I moved. Basically, I accepted the invitation to apply, and I got it, and I'm now at Warwick University, but I've stayed in Britain the whole time, and like I say, it's about a little more than 2/3 of my professional career now I've been in the UK.
Hmm. Very interesting. And then why transhumanism? What happened 15 years ago, roughly, or so, that actually you sort of changed your focus, or you've refocused your interest from epistemology into like transhumanism?
Yes, yes, because look, I mean, my original focus was on trying to understand how knowledge is developed and how it's changing. But all along, what has interested me is the way it changes our self-understanding, right? So it's not just about the more and different things that we know about the world, but what are, like you might say, the feedback implications of the ways we know and the sorts of things that we know for the ways we understand ourselves and how we conduct ourselves in the world. And it seems to me that transhumanism is extremely focused on this kind of matter, right? I mean, transhumanism has some very strong views about the ways in which science and technology ought to transform the way we think about ourselves and ought to transform the way we live, and how long we live and all the rest of it in a very direct kind of way, much more explicitly than I would say most even science-friendly philosophies have done in the past. Transhumanism is in a sense, there's this term that gets used often pejoratively, scientistic, right? The words transhumanism is, in a sense, very scientistic, right? Because in a sense, the science and technology is providing incredibly strong drivers for how human beings should think about the way they ought to live. And so that's kind of so that's where I make the transition, you might say, from the social epistemology into the transhumanism. But there was a more kind of you might say a more immediate focus, in terms of something, a practical thing that happened, and that was in the year 2006. I became the UK partner for a multinational European Union project that was studying the so-called converging technologies agenda. So this was an agenda that the European Union was basically creating kind of an imitation to what was already going on in the United States through the National Science Foundation. And so the idea was to think about, you might say, what would be a grand post-Cold War project for science? Because there was a sense in which science policy at the national and cross-national level suffered something of a meltdown after the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, as you probably know and or remember even, was very much the states very much focused a lot on science as the engines of progress, and the scientific community across the board benefited tremendously from this. Okay, in fact, it was kind of a golden age for science funding. And a lot of the stuff, especially a lot of the stuff having to do with information technology, was very much born from that kind of environment. Silicon Valley wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for the Cold War in terms of providing the infrastructure, which then after the Cold War gets devolved, and becomes all these companies that we now see in Silicon Valley. Okay. Now, the question for the science policy community after the Cold War was, what's going to be the next big project? And so in 2002, the National Science Foundation put out its own converging technologies document. And in fact, the two main authors of this document, Rocco and Bainbridge. Bainbridge may be familiar to transhumanists, okay, because he writes a lot on virtual reality, okay? And he was the head of the social informatics unit at the National Science Foundation and the co-author of this very important document. And what the document was basically arguing, and again, the European Union just basically copies this, is that you could see on the horizon that there are all of these developments taking place, many, if not most of them, in the private sector, having to do with developments in nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, cognitive science, neuroscience, all these kinds of fields. But they are proceeding rather independently of each other, okay? And so what a science policy initiative could do in this context is in some way to gather them together and channel their energies. In other words, to provide incentives for them to work with each other, to come up with a kind of interdisciplinary project, the goal of which would be to enhance the human condition. Okay? And so this is the transhuman moment going on here, right? Because the idea would be you'd have science policy explicitly channeling all these emerging sciences, right, in the direction of improving and enhancing, and the word enhancement was used, the human condition. Now, what exactly that meant in practice was interesting. There were two kinds of focuses then. One, and this was in retrospect, one might find this a little peculiar, but there was this focus on creating immunity to biological warfare. Okay, so the idea of making people more resilient, right? Because there was this great thought, that there was going to be a lot of biological warfare. So we're beyond the nuclear era, okay? And this was really, in a way, being conceptualized before people kind of got the full measure of what the so-called war on terror was going to look like, right? Because we're talking the early 2000s here. And so people were kind of imagining that the next frontier for war was going to be, biotechnological, basically.
Yeah, I was doing political science at the time, and exactly that was true because we were doing price comparison between nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and biotech weapons. And of course, nuclears were by far the hardest and most expensive to use. Chemicals were an order of magnitude cheaper, and then biological weapons of mass destruction were the easiest to produce, the cheapest, and etc.
Exactly.
So they were considered to be the highest dangers and the most likely ones to be used.
Well, that's right. And as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, if you go back to that period when there were congressional hearings on this, none other than the great Ray Kurzweil was talking about this. Okay. I mean, he'd already published at least one book on the singularity, but he was actually talking about biological warfare to Congress. Okay. But that was kind of only one side of the issue. The other side of the issue, which I find personally more interesting and in a way even maybe a little more controversial, is the idea of extending people's longevity so they don't have to retire so early and become a drain in the medical system. Okay? No, so in other words, this was a way to get around what people had been noticing already starting in the 1970s as the so-called fiscal crisis of the welfare state. Right? Because what the welfare state was basically originally designed when people's life expectancies were like 65 years old. right? In other words, you wouldn't be living too much longer, right? After after you were eligible to retire, you'd like die after a couple of years, and then
When
we'd have to be
Social
paying out
Security
pension.
was introduced in the US in the 1900s, the average life expectancy was 48,
Yes,
right?
exactly,
So you'd
right?
be dead for 20 years before you actually were able to collect a check from
Yeah,
the government.
exactly the point. Exactly the point. But of course, life expectancy, even without transhumanism, has gone up very high. Okay, and so, and not only that, of course, there was this concern that although people are living longer, they're not necessarily living healthier, more productive lives. Okay, so they are in a sense a drain on the medical system that way. Okay, and so you just and you just don't see this problem disappearing by itself. Okay, because people are living longer, they're not necessarily living healthier. Some people are, some people aren't, and it's enough of a financial problem. So what you basically want to do ideally is to have adequate grounds for actually raising the retirement age and keeping people more productive for a longer period of time. And so, even if you're looking for relatively modest gains, so that you're able to have people be productive realistically for another 5 to 10 years, and you could raise the retirement age to maybe up to 75 even, that would save an enormous amount of money. Okay, just doing that. And that's relatively modest from a kind of transhumanist point of view. But from the standpoint of balancing the budget, right, this would be brilliant. And so from the European Union side, this was the big deal, right? That it was, is there some way we can kind of, we can kind of expedite the development of research in things like, let's say, gene therapy, right? The kind of, actually some of the stuff that Aubrey de Grey goes on about, right? This idea of regenerating cells, and so you age at a slower rate, or you maybe be able to reverse the aging process. But the idea isn't Aubrey de Grey's idea, which is basically he thinks we'd be on holiday forever, but rather it would be to keep you in the workplace longer, right? So the idea would be to raise the retirement age. You see, now
Yes.
I find that as someone who has a lot of sympathy for the welfare state, I thought, wow, that's really smart. Now, you see, the interesting thing, of course, is that transhumanists don't normally think about the issue this way. But this is the reason why states are interested in this. You
Yeah.
see, and this is how I got into the topic in a very substantive kind of way and start to begin reading the literature, because it was really around 2005, 2006 that you really start to see a kind of critical mass and consolidation of all the transhumanist stuff on the table. And let me tell you again, it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say in terms of what you might think of as the critical moment for transhumanism. But I always see it in terms of the response of the extropians to the George W. Bush bioethics panel in 2005. Okay, because that was the panel that basically recommended a federal ban on stem cell research,
Yeah.
right? The Leon Kass Committee, which had people like Francis Fukuyama on it, and Michael Sandel, and a lot of religious people on it as well.
Fukuyama
And so
called transhumanism the most dangerous idea in the world at that
that's right. That's right. And he was one of the first to say it too. So I give him a little credit for that. He was already saying that like 2002 or 2003, before hardly anyone heard of transhumanism. But the thing is that it was in response to that all of these so-called extropians from that magazine, Extropy, the opposite of entropy, extropy, right? This is where you get in the same room and in the same document Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil and Nick Bostrom and Max Moore. In other words, guys who are coming into transhumanism from rather different directions, actually, right? I mean, if you look at these guys, even though we quite naturally think about them as transhumanists today, nevertheless, where they're actually coming from intellectually is somewhat different, okay?
Yeah,
Especially in
when
terms of how they go ahead.
you throw in David Pierce and a few others,
Exactly.
uh, 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 what's the cyborg Buddha guy? Oh my God,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. James Hughes.
James Hughes. How could I forget his name? That's embarrassing. James Hughes, who is a Buddhist. Like it's amazing the diversity of people's backgrounds that you see there, right?
Yes, but the see that the thing that
Moore also, and a few others like PJ Manny, and a bunch of others, and you have a very sort of diverse community.
But you see, I found that document that they did in response to the bioethics panel extremely illuminating. It was kind of like almost like an epiphany, because I think what really, and this is where I think George W. Bush did the transhumanist movement a favor, because he became the common enemy, right? And you began to get a sense of what are all these guys against, right? And it becomes clear when you look at the bioethics panel, because what they're against is an excessively precautionary approach to development of science and technology. They're also against people who are somehow afraid that science and technology is going to violate something natural about the human being, right? See, all of that stuff. I mean, it seems to me that the Bush bioethics panel in a way crystallized the enemy of transhumanism in a way that hadn't been so well crystallized before, especially at a political level. And so and I found that extremely revealing. And that's one of the reasons why one of the key concepts of transhumanism, which I really have held on to and tried to develop, is this proactionary principle, right? Because the proactionary principle comes about as the response to the precautionary principle of the Bush bioethics panel. That's where this principle first really gets articulated by Moore in a really strong way. And so that opened up, that really kind of made a lot of sense of things to me.
Yeah, why don't you just sort of spell them out, and the opposition between the proactionary and the traditionally precautionary principle, so that
Yeah.
those who may be unfamiliar with them can sort of get up to date?
Okay, well, first of all, the precautionary principle is actually a relatively well established principle, at least in international law, and especially in the European Union. And it's usually invoked in the context of innovations relating to public health and the environment. And it's if you want to put the precautionary principle in a nutshell, it's basically the Hippocratic Oath writ large. In other words, above all, do no harm,
Yes.
right? So it's a risk minimization strategy for innovation, for governance, for policy, whatever. So if there is even a small chance that there is going to be some very significant damage, then don't do it, right? Keep on just doing whatever pilot tests or something else to kind of lower the level of risk before you actually introduce stuff into the public. Now, the precautionary principle originated actually. It was a principle originally of forestry in the early 19th century. In other words, only cut down as many trees as you can replace, right? So the kind of worldview that was always behind the precautionary principle was one of a kind of equilibrium, right? A kind of sustainability model, right? Where there's a kind of natural norm that we should be always kind of aspiring to, right? And that is to say, a balance with nature, right? And so the idea of being in balance with nature is very much part of the metaphysics that informs the precautionary viewpoint. And so it's not surprising that it's been very central to a lot of ecological, environmental thinking.
Right,
Okay.
and that comes on the heels of the huge deforestation that's been happening sort of from the 14th to the 18th century to build
Yes.
all those fleets, both for wars and also for the New World discoveries and for commerce and all that, which happened all throughout Europe, especially in England, but also continental Europe. So that's
Yes.
sort of a result of that.
That's That's exactly right. And so this is so there's a kind of you can get a sense of what the mentality is here. It's one the key aspect of it is, well, two things. One is minimizing risk, okay, and the second thing is also this idea of a natural order, a natural norm, right? And then if you violate nature, nature's going to bite you back, right? And so so if you look at more extreme, some of the more extreme kind of predictions that we get, right? So you and your listeners may be familiar with the Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah.
The Gaia hypothesis is the idea that the Earth is one big organism, right? It's a self-maintaining, self-sustaining organism. And from that standpoint, right, human beings may just turn out to be a pest that over time will be eliminated by this superorganism called Earth. Okay? So the other thing I should say about the precautionary principle
We are a
is that,
virus, as Agent Smith put it.
yes, exactly. Or cockroaches. I mean, you can have all kinds of metaphors to use this in terms of how bad we are. But the point is, there is no special value being placed on the human being here, right? The human being only has value insofar as it can support the rest of nature, right? The value comes from nature. And humans are valuable only insofar as we remain a beneficial part of nature. And so the precautionary, and I stress this point because it seems to me that this is where transhumanism is really different in its kind of metaphysical conception of things, because transhumanism actually puts an enormous amount of faith in the human, right? And if anything, transhumanists are saying we're not human enough. We've got to really go full speed. We're holding ourselves back. We could be doing a lot more in terms of transforming our bodies and transforming our worlds, and creating the whole cosmos in the image and likeness of humanity. I mean, it seems to me this is kind of a very transhumanist way of looking at things. And you see, that's the enemy of the precautionary principle, because the precautionary principle doesn't privilege the human. Okay? I mean, it only privileges the human as one of among many life forms.
Okay, so the proactionary principle is.
The proactionary principle is, well, I mean, I have sometimes talked about it in a very flippant kind of way as basically a no pain, no gain principle, right? In other words, if you want to make big leaps and big progress, you got to take big risks. So in this respect, I would say the proactionary principle sort of sees the world a bit like the way entrepreneurs see things, right? In other words, every kind of risk is not a threat, but an opportunity. Right. And so the idea is you've got to explore all the opportunities that are out there. So you got to do the risky experiments. You've got to, you've got to do all this crazy stuff in a way. Some of it will fail. A lot of it may fail. But there's a general kind of faith that we will be able to overcome it, that we are resilient, right? And that we will just carry forward. And the evidence for that is, of course, human history, because human history is this incredible thing from the standpoint of success and failure, right? I mean, we have all this amazing progress in science and technology over the last 250, 300 years. But, we have the Industrial Revolution, but now we have the climate change crisis. We have all the greatest science in the world in the physical sciences and the biological sciences. But then we get 2 world wars, right? I mean, all of this stuff goes together, right? They all seem to be happening together. And I think the attitude of the proactionary principle in all this is to say, well, yes, that's kind of how it goes, right? That in a sense, if you want to make the big leaps, right, the big progress, then you've got to kind of expect, right, at a certain level, right, that things might not always go to plan. And so you cannot be so fixated on avoiding harm. Now, you see, that's a very strong way of putting the proactionary principle. And I should say that most transhumanists sort of skirt around this a little bit. In other words, most transhumanists don't quite want to talk about what it means to say when you say we're risk takers. Well, risk takers means you fail a lot of times, just like entrepreneurs fail, right? What is it, 85, 90% of all, startup businesses fail, right? And then people just carry on. Okay, and I think that but it seems to me that's a radically different way of looking at the world and looking at human beings from the precautionary principle.
Yeah, and also different transhumanists have different degrees of tolerance of risk. So that's kind of like a very sort of personal line to demarcate where, risk begins and too much risk begins and where it's kind of like acceptable. But let me go back.
But let me just point out something
Sure,
here. If you
sure.
look at somebody like Elon Musk, okay, look at Elon Musk.
Right, right.
That guy's like the most proactionary guy in the cosmos, right? Today I was reading in the newspaper he wants to send nukes to Mars in order to make it habitable. Okay, now you might say this guy's nuts, but the point is, this seems to me it is within one, and this is where I think transhumanists, in a way, have to kind of see that the logic of the ideas do kind of tend to push you in this way, right? And if you look at the prehistory of transhumanism, let's say through the Italian futurists or the Russian cosmists and all these guys had some pretty radical, far out views of how much human beings ought to be pushing themselves.
Right. So I'm going to come back to both of
Okay,
those,
okay.
but and the roots, because the etymology of transhumanism is important here. But
Yes,
but let
yes.
me just get a few more sort of personal details out here in the open that I think may be pertinent to a different degree. So let me just ask you straight up: are you considering yourself a transhumanist?
I would say yes, of a sort. I mean, certainly I'm not a post-humanist. So no, because for me that distinction does see in a way that for me the distinction between transhumanism and posthumanism is like the distinction between proactionary and precautionary.
Very good. Hold on to that.
Okay,
That's part of
okay,
the conversation. Very important part. But hold on to that. So
okay.
before we get to the actual meat of the matter and the definitions and the nitty gritty, so you are a transhumanist, but one interesting thing is that you have a sort of a Jesuit training in education, if I'm correct. Is that true?
Yes.
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 So tell me a
Yes.
little bit
So,
about that, because I think those may be connected, or at least some
oh,
people would say
yes.
they're connected.
Yes. Well,
How did
look, I
that
mean,
happen? Was that in high school? Where was that, and what kind of impact did it have?
well, look, okay, so I come from a relatively poor background, so I'm a product of scholarship in terms of having gone through schools, and so
Did you go
I
to a
was
Jesuit high school, or
exactly through scholarship. I went to a Regis High School in New York City, which is one of the in terms of entrance examination scores and stuff. It's always been in the top 5 in the United States. It's a it's actually it's a very interesting kind of Jesuit school because it's not it's while it is run by Jesuits, it is actually classified as a private independent school because it's in the will of the benefactor. It's not part of the church that makes this a Jesuit school. It was a request on the part of the rich guy who benefacted the school that the Jesuits should run it. So what that means is that there is actually the school has a larger percentage of lay teachers, right? Non priests, as well as lots of Jesuits. Now I went to school in the 1970s. Okay, so we're talking about the late 1970s here, and this was the period where the Jesuits were very much associated with liberation theology, right? This kind of hybrid of, part of the, again, I don't want to go through the whole history of the Catholic Church during this period, but some people
especially
may
the
know
Latin
that
American Jesuit wing sort of was like pushing that and got
exactly,
killed
and it was
literally in many countries.
yes, that's right, and it was a part of a general kind of liberalization that the Catholic Church was undergoing during that time as a result of the Vatican II Council. I don't want to have to go into that in too much detail, but it was a liberal period for the Catholic Church generally, and one of the people who was discussed um, among my Jesuit teachers, sometimes in somewhat guarded tones, was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Okay, so just for people in your audience who don't know who he was, um, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest. He was also a paleontologist, and he was part of the expedition that in the 1920s went and kind of made sense of what we now call Peking man. Okay, this kind of ancestor of human beings from about 500,000 years ago, and he was part of that. So he was a real serious scientist as well as being a Jesuit, and he wrote a lot of books. And these books were banned by the Catholic Church because he was arguing a kind of transhumanist line, basically.
The
Okay,
Omega point. He coined the Omega point.
that's right. He's the Omega point. That's right. That's right. And the doctrine, the doctrine is, if you read and Teilhard de Chardin's books, um, started to be. It was possible to buy them and read them generally after he died in the mid 1950s, and so they started to get translated into English. And among the people who were promoting his work in English were not just left wing Jesuits like my teachers, but also people like Julian Huxley, the man who coined the term transhumanism, and Theodosius Dobzhansky, who's one of the founders of the modern evolutionary synthesis, who happened to be a Ukrainian Orthodox Christian as well. And so these guys were, in fact, writing introductions to Teilhard de Chardin's books. Okay, The Phenomenon of Man, for example, which is probably his major work. And again, for people who've never looked at Teilhard de Chardin's work, it is quite it's a bit weird because what it is a combination of well, so imagine you have somebody who is basically trying to interpret the Bible, but using science as a way of trying to make sense of like what Jesus is saying and other things that are happening in the Old and New Testament, and then putting that within a kind of cosmic evolutionary framework, where basically the idea is that the entire cosmos is evolving into God, and we, the humans, are kind of the brain of this. Okay, so we are kind of the brain of this kind of cosmic evolutionary process. So we're the ones directing it. And Teilhard de Chardin was someone who understood this in a very robust kind of way. So not just is he talking, so he is talking about a kind of emergent collective intelligence, what he called the noosphere, right? Noosphere, which is this kind of emerging collective intelligence that he said would be very much, in a way, he sounded to my ears and my mind in the 1970s very much like Marshall McLuhan about the global village, right? He was thinking kind of all of the rise in global telecommunications was going to create this prospect of a kind of collective intelligence, and so some people think he anticipated the internet and all that, okay? But in a way, that's not so important. What's important, though, is that he thought that this was part of the way in which, human beings would kind of evolve in a kind of self-directed manner. So it wouldn't be just
Teleological, maybe not so self-directed, but as kind of fulfilling a
yes,
teleological path towards God, right? Because
yes,
it's a
except that it's
predestined. It's not exactly self-directed, but it's like predestined from our conception to our sort of omega point fulfillment.
yes, except that I think he was quite open-minded, you might say, as to what exactly form this final thing would take. So what you don't get in Teilhard de Chardin is a really, so he doesn't read the Bible in the way that he somehow thinks that there are passages in the Bible that tell you what it's all going to look like once the plan is over, right? I mean, so it isn't reading it that way. Rather, he's kind of reading it more in a prophetic mode, about pointing in a direction,
Mhm.
and so. But the other point I want to make is it wasn't just at this kind of collective spiritual level. He did talk about the kinds of stuff that Julian Huxley and Dobzhansky and other people would be talking about as eugenics, right? So he was talking about the shaping of the biological, of the material part of this
And
as well. It
Julian's
wasn't just,
brother Aldous also spoke about that.
well, no, exactly. And Aldous Huxley and Brave New World is a satire on Julian Huxley, right? I mean, that's one way to read. If
That's
you
the
want to read
brotherly thing to do, right?
yeah, no. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, one of the things when I teach about transhumanism to undergraduates, I invoke Brave New World because most of the students in Britain will have read Brave New World as high school students. It's part of the required curriculum. And even though the book was written in 1932, nevertheless, I asked the students to read it because I want to see whether they find it quite as satirical as Aldous Huxley meant it. In other words, if so for Aldous Huxley's audience, people would say, "Wow, this whole idea that you could have kind of an assembly line approach for manufacturing human beings as if they were baked products, and a lot of the stuff that is very much part of the fabric of Brave New World." I think nowadays a lot of younger people don't actually see it as so satirical. They say, well, there's something there that might, that's not so different from the world we live in. What's so funny about that? Right? We live in this world,
Yeah.
and and so that's why I do find it. I think the response of students today to something like Aldous Huxley is not quite as you would expect, right? Because and to this extent, I would say that the younger people are already kind of living in the transhumanist imaginary because they actually think something like Brave New World might be kind of good. Okay, so you mentioned David Pierce earlier. I could see David Pierce right out of Brave New World with his attitudes towards suffering and all that, right?
Right, the hedonistic imperative.
Exactly. That's Soma City, right? Soma and Brave New World,
Yeah.
right? That's not meant to be satirical. That's meant to be a serious philosophical position.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that a little bit later because I have a question from him for you.
Sure.
But I
Oh,
want
you do. Oh, you do.
yeah, of course. But I wanted to bring in this kind of uh, origin, sort of your background, if you will, because I believe it would all come together a little bit later on with the cosmists and the other ideas that we're going to talk about. So okay, so you went into a Jesuit school. So then I have to ask you straight up. Then, are you a Christian? Because that
Well,
kind of has pertinence to our conversation in terms of
yeah.
our own presuppositions, backgrounds, beliefs, biases, etc.
I look. Well, first of all, since I was trained by the Jesuits, you know, even saying I'm a Christian already opens up a lot of questions, because the Jesuits themselves have always had a kind of problematic relationship, should we say, right? Because they have a very kind of flexible notion of Christianity.
They were
And I
walking
guess I am,
the edge for 1,000 years.
yes, exactly. And I'm sort of in that camp. And I do think it's important to say that. Um, and again, a lot depends. One reason why I'm always reluctant to just say I'm a Christian is because that kind of can give people the wrong impression if they have certain kind of stereotype views of what Christians are, and what the bottom line is for being a Christian. So, but you're absolutely right that Christianity is very central to the way I think about transhumanism. And so, people who have read my work will, you can't go a few pages without seeing some theology in there, right?
Yeah.
And for people who think that transhumanism is some atheistic view, right, they could be totally confused, right? Because but the connection to Christianity, I think, is the one that I would begin with. And I think that all transhumanists or people sympathetic to transhumanism need to take seriously. It is that it is through Christianity, especially, but more generally through the Abrahamic religions, so Judaism and Islam, that we get this privileged view of human beings in the cosmos. And of course, in Christianity, there
That's
is an enormous
special.
amount of, yes, exactly. And especially after St. Augustine, we start to get a very strong emphasis in Christianity in the idea that humans are created in the image and likeness of God, which of course appears in Genesis, but a lot of things happen in Genesis. And Augustine, in the 4th century AD, one of the great founding fathers of the church, he put a lot of emphasis on that, right? And he said that this was a very defining thing about human beings. And it seems to me that if you don't hold on to that view, then I don't see how you can be a you need that view for transhumanism. You need a kind of privileged view of the human as your start off point, from which then you're going to say all the stuff that humans do are going to somehow launch us into the cosmos. Otherwise, it just seems crazy. You see, this is the thing I think and a lot of people do think transhumanism is crazy, right? I mean, and I think a lot has to do with the fact that if you're not a transhumanist, you have to ask, where is the intuition for transhumanism coming from? Why can't people just accept that they're only going to live X number of years and do things in normal ways, et cetera, et cetera? Why do they have to have this kind of grandiose view of human beings living forever and conquering the cosmos and all this kind of stuff? And I'm saying that it comes from this. It comes from this theological vision of human beings as having a privileged place by virtue of our relationship to God. That is, I think, really important. And it's been secularized, right? Obviously, it's been secularized. And the Enlightenment, of course, is a very instrumental part of that historical development, because the Enlightenment is really where the secularization happens. Okay? And so instead of talking about our soul, we start talking about reason, right? Reason becomes the thing with a capital R, and this is the thing that humans have. You see, and transhumanism is basically the heir to this whole development in history.
Excellent. So now is the time to start moving into the definitions and the matter. But before we talk about transhumanism, before we talk about trans anything, we have to talk about that and that something. What is that something
Human,
that we're going
the
to be
human.
going trans? You know.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So
Okay, see,
what is human first of all? Because we can't
okay,
have transhuman without human. So I've asked this question
yes, you're right, you're right.
millions of times. What is human?
Okay, okay. Yes, I have given this an enormous amount of thought. And in fact, the first book I wrote on transhumanism broadly, Humanity 2.0, in a way, I really begin to think about this. And I've thought about this a lot more since then. So the first point I would make about human is that human is primarily a normative term, not a descriptive term. Okay? So in other words, it isn't, when we talk about human, we're not necessarily, we're not, it's neither sufficient nor necessary, I think, to imagine that we're talking about an upright ape. Okay? That, no, because I think this is really important, because human, if you go back and you look at the way in which the concept of human and the idea of being human, right, and somehow becoming human, through education primarily. That was historically the way by which people became human, right? It's like being civilized. Human is in a way kind of a synonym for civilized, I think, or cultured, right? I think that's kind of the way you got to look at it, right? And so that in some sense, the presupposition was, from the ancient Greeks, let's say, let's start with them for the sake of argument, that you got an animal, right? You got an animal that has a capacity to be human, right? But the capacity the capacity has to be trained up. You got to teach someone how to be human, basically, right? That was kind of what the Greeks thought. And of course, one of the big issues from a political standpoint that's been very thorny over this history is which of these, animals is eligible to be educated to become a human, right? And so the issue about gender and race and all this stuff, in a way, is very much part of that discussion, right? And within the context of ancient Greece, even when they're talking about who is eligible for this kind of humanizing process, it's quite clear it's going to be certain kinds of males who are typically able to afford to do it. Okay, they could pay Plato, or something like this.
Right, but on the other hand, Plato was very open to the idea that slaves had the same capacity as
They
free
have the same
citizens,
capacity, of course.
and
That's
women
right.
too, by the way. And
Yes,
because
capacity.
Plato was a wrestler actually himself,
Mhm.
he even thought that women had the same capacity for wrestling. So
That's right.
in
But
that
I think
sense,
there was even an open question among the Greeks about whether what kinds of animals had the capacity for being human. Okay, so if and I always like to point this out to people because you see an enormous amount of this literature in Greek world, especially, that actually seems to make very substantive human like claims about animals. Okay, about animals being, I mean, and you could say, oh, that's just anthropomorphism, that's just metaphor. Well, see, I think that what we're doing there is we're reading a very modern perspective into those guys, right? Because we have a kind of view now, starting, let's say, I would say from the middle of the 18th century onward, where we start to identify those beings that are eligible to be human have to be upright apes, right? Linnaeus. As soon as you get Homo sapiens, right, as a kind of biological, a very specific kind of biological marker for the human, right? Even though Linnaeus himself is a creationist, so he's not committed to evolution, but he is committed to the idea of fixing the human on the very particular animal species. Because, of course, the Greeks, the Romans, the Christians, they all believed the humans were a kind of animal, but they're very vague about what kind of animal we're talking about here, right? You don't get in Thomas Aquinas' discussion of apes, okay? So the thing here is, it's only in the mid 18th century that we start to zoom in on this idea that there is one biological species that is eligible for being human. And then, of course, evolution takes up the argument in the 19th century and carries it on to the present day. And it's in the context of evolutionary theory that then you get this term anthropomorphism that then gets used to talk about people in the past who talked about other animal species as potentially human. Okay? So the word anthropomorphism is actually a coinage of George Romanes, one of Darwin's students in the late 19th century, and then it gets applied to all these other attempts, by people in other cultures to say that animals have human characteristics. But my point to you is, it was an open question until the mid 18th century which animal species were eligible for being human, because human was primarily a normative characteristic. It was the fulfillment of some kind of capacity that you could be trained in. And as you know, right, even in the 18th century, people were having all kinds of discussions about, training apes to talk and training animals to do all kinds of human-like things, right? Serious people were talking this way, right? Because what that shows you is that the concept of the human wasn't specifically tied to a particular species, right? It was this kind of, free floating set of qualities that all kinds of beings in principle could have. So one more thing I would say, you may know that in the Renaissance in particular, you start to get this discussion of the possibility of life on other planets, right? That there are other worlds, especially when you start to get Giordano Bruno and you start to get this blasting open of the Aristotelian universe, and people start to think there's an infinite universe with infinite stars and there's infinite Earths and all these things, right? Very much part of the kind of post-Giordano Bruno thing, which is becomes part of the metaphysics of modern physics. And so a lot of people are writing about beings on other planets. They don't look, and they draw them. They don't look like apes, right? They look more like Martians from science fiction stories, right? So in other words, they don't have any kind of clear sort of physiological relationship to us, because being human, right, being our equal, wasn't necessarily so closely tied to that. You see, now the reason why I'm saying all this, okay, I'm going on at such length, is because now move to transhumanism. And part
Okay,
of the,
but before we do that jump, so
okay,
what's, just for to being succinct and clear, do we have a definition of what it is human before we get
it's not a thing. A human is a set of qualities, right, which has, and they're all these very positive qualities. So qualities like, consciousness, intelligence, rationality, right, communicability, right, comprehensive thinking, all of these things, yes, all of these things are part of what it is to be human. But then the question becomes, what kinds of beings can actually manifest these things, and how do they manifest them? Okay. And I think this question becomes really important for transhumanism, because transhumanism takes very seriously the idea that artificial intelligence, for example, could count as human beings, or at least as persons, right? That in some sense they could be one of our equals. And you see, for me, that shouldn't be so surprising from the standpoint of the history of human as a concept, because the concept of human has never been tied so specifically to a particular biological species. So then we should be quite open-minded in principle as in terms of the kinds of beings that might be eligible to be human. And
Mhm.
this is where transhumanism, I think, is actually on the right track there.
Right. So for me, here, the way I usually like to put it is that being human is not an entity, but rather it's a process. It's a
Mhm.
process of sort of constant becoming and constant redefinition of
Yeah.
every new generation in every new epoch, where each and every member of that generation has to rediscover and redefine for themselves the meaning of being human. Therefore, it's just this kind of process rather than a single entity.
One other thing I would add to that, I agree, of course. But the other thing I would add is that, and this is where the collective dimension comes in. Um, in a sense, you have to be recognized as human, and this is why I find something, something like the Turing test. I actually take that very seriously. I mean, obviously, if we wanted to come up with a kind of Turing test to determine human versus non-human, it's obviously a very complicated thing. Though there are people working on it, and I can send you the name of someone who actually I think you should be talking to on this matter, because there are people who are trying to, as it were, have a kind of cross species sort of Turing test thing that, because if part of what we want to say about being a human is to have a certain kind of level of intelligence that allows for autonomy, self-determination, all those wonderful things, we have to make sure that when we are interrogating the candidates, as it were, to see whether they have it, that we're actually communicating with them at the right level to be able to understand what they're saying.
Right.
And obviously, this is going to be different depending on whether we talk to an animal or a machine or whatever. And I think this is the interesting and challenging question, right? That if we are operating with a very how should we say, substrate neutral, right? If to use this term
Yep.
from cognitive science, right? So substratum being the material stuff out of which things are made, and within cognitive science, it is quite normal for people to believe that minds, a mind can exist in many different substrate, right? So it could exist in a carbon-based substrate like animals, like us, right? Or it could exist in a silicon-based substrate. And then the question becomes, if you want to say both of these things have minds, then how do you need to address them in a way that this becomes evident, right? And it seems to me the Turing test is very sensitive to this kind of point, and this is necessary, I think, when we're going to judge candidates for humanity in the future, as we start to get this much more expansive notion that transhumanists invites us to have.
Yeah, and for me, I have sort of the Socratic test of intelligence, or even artificial intelligence, if you will, and that's simply kind of stemming from the Socratic dialectical method of investigation, but also from a thing that Pablo Picasso said, which was computers are very dumb. They can only give you answers. But humans give you really interesting questions, right? So for me, the Socratic test for AI or for intelligence in general is not the answers that you're able to produce, but the type of questions that you're able to ask. And so that's the first thing that I would ask a potential AI in a sort of a in a sort of a quasi Turing test would be, not only that watch the answers that it or they are giving to my questions, but also ask him, okay, what kind of questions do you have for me? What are you interested in yourself?
Yeah, but well, if I may say, I see where you're coming from, and I do have sympathy with it. Um, but I do think, I mean, but I think, in a sense, the spirit of the Turing test, because the way you've described the issue is that you already know this thing's an AI, right? Right,
Yeah,
and so
but
you're then asking whether this AI actually meets some level of being human. But that's not really how the Turing test works. The Turing test
I
works.
get
You
that.
don't know what the thing is. You don't know what you don't know whether it is human or AI, and you've got to guess, right?
Yeah,
And the question I have to you then is: a lot of human beings can't give you questions back.
but
Okay, a lot of human beings.
that's why I said that this is also the test for intelligence, not just artificial intelligence.
I know, but the point is, no. But I see.
Right.
I'm raising a
So
serious.
when I talk to somebody else, I'm not only interested into the answer. When we have a good conversation with somebody, I'm not just interested in the answers they're giving me, but actually I'm more interested in the kind of questions they're going to ask. Right. That's like the real high level for me.
Dark side of this kind of preference I have for the Turing test
Hmm.
is that if you're sufficiently substrate neutral, then in a sense you're not going to be privileging carbon anymore, right?
Of course.
And
Yeah.
right, and I do think this is something. This is going to be, I think, part of the, you might say, the future politics of transhumanism, um, because as we become more liberal in principle in allowing beings that come with from different substrate to count as humans, what is going to happen to the people, who are thought to be human simply because they are Homo sapiens, even if they
Right.
do not pass these kinds of advanced, sophisticated sort of tests, which I think we will end up going toward, to be honest with you. So I think the kind of thing you're talking about is kind of where we're going. But I do think this does have some very interesting and potentially, well, how should we say, controversial implications for carbon based human beings.
Absolutely. So we'll get to the implications, but let's first lay down the sort of the groundwork in terms of definition. So we spent some time on being human and the sort of the difficulty that
Mhm.
historically for thousands of years we have, and we still don't have a simple definition, let alone a biological one, about what it actually means to be a human, right? And the interesting thing is, by the way, that I interviewed Professor Hiroshi Ishiguro from the University of Osaka, who is the sort of the father of the Geminoid line of robots. And he told me that the reason why he's making Geminoid robots is because he's trying to figure out what it means to be human. And after he's been doing that obviously for 25 or 30 years, and I asked him, okay, so what's the conclusion that you've reached after decades of doing this work? And he's the best that he could master in response was, well, actually the definition is changing.
Yeah, yeah.
So
No, but do you remember Norbert Wiener's final book, Golem Inc.? Right, because he actually talks about the design of cybernetic systems very much in this kind of light, like this Japanese guy did. Namely, that the reason why you do make these systems is to figure out what it is to be human, and he compares it with the biblical project, blasphemous biblical project of creating a golem, right? Where out of clay, stone, we would say silicon now, you try to create a human just like God created humans.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so enough about the human part. Okay, so where does the trans come and what does it mean? And then of course we're gonna have to go one step up in the post, because you
Yeah.
make a very important distinction there, which I think escapes, and it's very different than perhaps the popular understanding of the post-human. So let's talk about first the transhuman. What is it?
Okay, well, so the transhuman, uh, first of all, it starts with the human, and it says basically we need to be more human. So what I mean by that is that if you think about the things that distinguish human beings the most from other animals, from other things, it's typically those qualities that are the ones that transhumanists want to amplify. Okay, and one of the reasons why I think transhumanists tend to be quite liberal, and in fact, there is this phrase which I think is quite important in transhumanism: morphological freedom. Morphological freedom. You have the right to be in whatever form you want to be, basically, right? If you want to upload your mind to a machine, God bless you, you can do that. If you want to live forever in your own body, you can do that, right? So there's this kind of very ontologically tolerant position, okay? And that's because transhumanists believe that the qualities that make us human are the ones that make us different from everything else. And so what you're trying to do is amplify that by whatever means it takes, right? If you can do it within your biological body, that's fine, but you don't need to be in your biological body. You could go, into cyberspace or something, right? So the point here is that the trans is basically an amplification of the human, because that's what's good about us. What's good about us is not that we are living, not that we are biological, right? That is not actually what's good about us. What's good about us is the distinctive bits, the things that make us different from everything else that is living or biological or whatever. That's where transhumanism has this connection with the theological view.
And that's exactly where sort of you have to start with this presupposition that we have this kind of a privileged, unique position,
Yes,
perhaps at least on our planet, but also perhaps in the cosmos.
that's correct. Yes, and in fact, I always thought Ray Kurzweil, um, who in many ways is one of the real founders of this kind of, he really got the measure of this very early on when, he's writing books like The Age of Spiritual Machines, right? And then this journalist in the San Francisco area, Eric Davis, wrote this book, Technosis, right? Technosis, Gnosis, which, again, for people who know something about theology, know that Gnosticism was a kind of heresy within Christianity, which basically said that what was wrong with the human condition, the reason why we were fallen, was we were stuck in our bodies, right? And that that if we escape our bodies, right, in some sense, yet to be determined, we will in fact leave our fallen state and be able to reunite with God, right? And the world, and we'll all live happily ever after, right? But the problem is just being stuck in our bodies, right? So it's a very and transhumanism, I do really think, has this, and certainly that is the allure of the very idea of uploading your mind into a machine, right? Because as you probably know from people you've spoken to, there are a lot of people who think the very idea of uploading your mind into a machine, even if you can do it, is crazy,
Yeah.
right? But obviously, it's not. You need to have a certain kind of view of the human being to think it's not crazy, and it is one that has, I think, a certain, perhaps even quite strong Gnostic dimension to it, where in some sense your body as it is kind of the problem, right? It's kind of, in a way, it represents the problem you have to get beyond. Like you
Right.
don't live long enough, like you're not smart enough, right? I mean, there's a sense in which we have to self-transcend. And that is very crucial, I think, to the transhumanist imaginary.
Right. And so let me ask you this right here then about this kind of an attack that usually happens. Because let's say we recognize these kind of theological origins of transhumanism and the sort of the presupposition of the Homo sapiens unique place in the cosmos. Now, then, basically, the charge comes is that transhumanism is religion for geeks, right? It's
Well,
basically a new a new a new Christianity. It's at its core, as you said, a new Abrahamic religion where the path to transcendence is just a technological path. You know,
well,
and it promises
well.
the same thing: eternal life, salvation, but it's kind of like a biological, if you will, salvation, at least in some of the versions and so on. And therefore, that's the grounds for dismissal of it, especially if you come sort of from a scientific slash especially atheistic background, and people would say, well, this is kind of a new religion. but it's just one of many sort of new scientific religions. You know, what
Well,
do you
first of all,
think of that term?
look. First point is there's truth to this. Truth to it in the sense that and I mentioned this earlier when we were discussing about scientism, right? That transhumanism is scientific. There's no doubt about it. And I think it is true. And I think, and again, this is where I think transhumanists sometimes aren't straight with themselves or straight with others about what they are, and so they shouldn't be surprised by the kind of thing you just said, right? That people say against transhumanists, because it is true. I think that transhumanism is a kind of what you might call materialist theology, right? I mean, and it's not the and so when people ask me, from the theological standpoint, other than the sort of things I've just mentioned now, what would be precursors to transhumanism? I would point to, if you look at in the 19th century,
Cosmism.
especially, well, cosmism, yes, okay, and we could talk about that separately. But I want to raise a couple of other things which people don't normally associate with transhumanism, but do have elements of it, or at least in terms of the orientation. Okay, the 19th century was in the United States was very full of what were called metaphysical religions. And these metaphysical religions, they were often very closely associated with the transcendentalist movement of Emerson, Thoreau, these kinds of people from New England. And they had certain kind of characteristics to them. One of them was that they basically believed that you could use science to channel your divine powers. Okay? And so even something like the Christian Science movement, which is very much against using medicine, nevertheless very much believed in willpower and mind control, right? And they actually had a very scientific way of thinking about this, right? That in some sense Jesus was teaching us a certain kind of meditation or mental discipline or something, right? That science, would reinforce. And then on the other end, you had something like Mormonism, okay? The Church of the Latter-day Saints, which basically has invested enormous amounts of money in biomedical research in the United States. In fact, they may be, I think, in terms of private investment, may in fact be the largest investors in, because they have hospitals and universities and everything all over the place. And they are fixated on the idea of the resurrection of the body. Okay, right? Because the Mormons interpret the New Testament and as a kind of materialism, basically, right? As a materialism, right? All the and cosmism has this characteristic as well, right? That all the dead are going to get raised, literally, right? So it's going to be one big cryonics festival, basically. That's kind of what the Mormons are. No, this is where the cryonics stuff comes from, right? I mean, it's very and the point is, this is very continuous. Once in the 19th century, once you start to get very kind of secularized materialist versions of the United States as the promised land, okay, and that this is where the second coming's going to happen, right? And we've got to prepare ourselves for it with our modern techniques. Okay, this, it seems to me, sets you up very much in the direction of transhumanism. Okay, and so I don't see really a break at all. I think where the break comes in is with more traditional, conventional church-based religions. But in terms of all of these kind of splintering off of Christianity that you start to see in the 19th century, it seems to me it's quite continuous with what transhumanism ends up doing. So this is what I always tell my religious friends. I say, you look at the doctrines of these people, like the Mormons and so forth. These are proto-transhumanist doctrines. Come on, right?
Yeah,
I
and I
mean,
mentioned here the president of the Mormon Transhumanist Association twice, Lincoln Cannon, uh,
yes,
and other figures like that. Actually, another Christian transhumanist was Frank J. Tipler, who basically told me
of
straight up
course.
that the omega point or the singularity is coming for sure, but I was skeptical about it because he understood quantum mechanics and I didn't. And
Yeah, no. I know Frank. I've met him, and he is a very interesting guy. I'll tell you, he's a very interesting guy. Really against the grain, but a person who, again, I would say I would put him in this kind of category of people I was just talking about. Right, someone who has a very strongly biblically based version of Christianity. I don't know if you've read any of his book, The Physics of Immortality, and all this kind of stuff. He's quoting the Bible. He's like Teilhard de Chardin. He writes exactly like that. Oh, except the physics is his science rather than paleontology. but Tipler's exactly the same way. And my view about this is this wrong? Is there something wrong? I mean, it's a little strange from the standpoint of the conventions of how religion and science are supposed to mix together. I realize that. I realize it's unconventional, right? But intellectually, it seems to me, it has a certain kind of compelling character to it. And given that we're talking about theories, especially in physics, which are pretty speculative no matter how you look at it. Okay, come on, guys. String theory, really? Don't tell you got a problem with God. I got a problem with string theory. And so the point is that given that we're dealing with a realm of science that is already open to a wide range of speculation, which contemplates all kinds of very weird ontologies. The fact that someone is talking about God in the singularity seems to me just part of the mix in that regard, that people shouldn't be so scandalized by that, right? And so, no, really,
But the
really.
point is that the original question that I had is, the point is that it's kind of detrimental to the sort of reputation of both the transhumanism and the singularity as ideas, given that the charge is that they're just another new religion that's like for geeks, and
Well, look,
therefore
religion.
dismiss as just all the other fake religions that have no
See,
historical truth to them of any kind.
look, what I cannot solve is the problem that people have with religion. Okay, in other words, I think that there was an enormous amount of licensed bigotry against religion among intellectuals. Okay, and I don't know how to deal with that, and that's a general problem. That's not just a problem that transhumanists have.
But,
Okay, I
but
mean,
intellectuals would give you a history of inquisition and suppression of science and knowledge, and burning people on the stake and all kinds of stuff like that for the.
yeah, and I'll give you World War II any day. World
Sorry.
War II was caused by science. World War One was certainly caused by science. Come on, we got two world wars where science has caused more damage than the Inquisition ever caused. Give me a break. You can't play that game. You're not going to win it. Science is so much more powerful.
So how is it that science caused World War One and World War Two?
Well, because in terms of the amount of damage it did, okay, and
Well,
also
that
the
was
fact that
instrumental, but not like.
it wasn't instrumental. In fact, people believed they could win the war because they had the superior science. This is certainly true on the German side in World War One, and I
Yes,
think it was true on the American side in World War Two.
yes, and even
Okay.
especially during the Cold War too, was
Yes,
basically
exactly.
a
No, no,
race
and the
against science. Yeah.
No, and I think that's where the Cold War, in a way, is it's very interesting and in a way very morally instructive, because we didn't get World War III. That the science actually managed to curb itself, right? That I think with the Cold War, primarily through the introduction of game theory, actually, that you start to get a kind of self reflection that got built into the science, so that the science didn't just get derailed and end up causing destruction. So in this regard, I'm sort of on the same page as Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker always likes to bring out the Cold War as a great example of how we're making moral progress, right? Because we were able to kind of curb ourselves. And I do think there
Or
is
we
something
were
to.
just lucky, because there were so many occasions where we were so close, and we were simply lucky because the world was about to end several times, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where an American destroyer was trying to sink a Russian submarine which had nuclear weapons and authorization to use them. Then there was like the fake alarms in the 80s, where was his name, Vasily Petrov or something like that, who had, like, I don't know, 6 minutes to basically sound the alarm of impending American nuclear attack, which was kind of a fake alarm. And so many other cases where if people actually followed the manual, we'd all be dead now.
Sure, but the point was, I do think that people were sufficiently aware, and this is where I do think game theory and stuff like that as part of the Cold War imaginary was very important, because what I think people in the Cold War had, which I think in the two world wars wasn't so clear, was there was a kind of self-consciousness of all of the mistakes we might make, right? Because game theory laid out all the possibilities. What are the optimal outcomes, suboptimal outcomes, right? And I think that was really registering in people. And I really do think that led to a certain kind of curbing. Maybe I'm being too idealistic about this, but I don't think it's an accident, right?
I, I I tend to disagree with you on that. I don't think that the captain of that Russian submarine or Vasily Petrov were maybe even not familiar with game theory. They were just thinking about, what if I'm wrong? What if I launch this nuclear armed torpedo right now that the Americans don't know about? Or what if this radar, which tells me, the earning warning system that tells me of incoming American missiles, is wrong, and we launch and they haven't
Well,
launched?
no, but look, but part of game theory is also to know what the probabilities are of things being wrong, right? So, in other words, if you are operating on the assumption that the instruments that you're using aren't always going to be right, and you have to factor that into your judgment, and then you look at the potential damage that could be done if you make the judgment wrong, right? All of that is a game theoretic way of balancing stuff. And,
Sure.
and I'm just saying that this really becomes self-conscious because it becomes highly theorized and people get trained in this stuff starting in the 1950s and 60s. I don't think that's a trivial point.
Yeah, I don't think the Russian submarine captains were trained in game theory, but yeah, I get.
Okay, maybe not. I don't want to push it too far. No, I'm not going to say everybody learned, everybody knows game theory when they're 5 years old or something. No.
Yeah,
No, that would
okay.
be a nice idea. The Soviets probably would go around saying that. We train our people. They know game theory.
Well, okay, so we talked about the human and the transhuman. Let's move on to the post-human here because time is advancing. So, okay, so where does the post come in? So we talked about the trans. Where's the post? And how is it different from the trans? Because there
Okay.
is popular perception that the post is simply a continuation of the trans, but you draw a distinction there, very clear distinction. So talk us through that.
Okay. So the simple difference is that transhuman, right, basically is like ultrahuman, wants to take what is distinctive about the human and amplify it, whereas posthuman wants to decenter the human. In other words, part of the posthumanist imaginary, especially as it's articulated in a lot of the, I would say, in a lot of the kind of cultural studies side of all of this, which is a lot of the academic literature that is on posthumanism, coming from people like Donna Haraway and people of that kind. um, they basically believe that the human is, in a sense, the source of the problems. Okay, that the post that and so the post-human imaginary is very much fixated. I would say these days on this thing called the Anthropocene. Okay,
It's about
so the
dethroning. So basically, here's a charge, and you tell me if I get this right. The charge is that the Enlightenment and transhumanism basically killed God and installed ourselves on his throne as the center of the universe, as the measure of everything around us,
that's right.
the ultimate destiny and the decision maker and the giver of life and death, the end of the beginning of everything. And then the post-humanism in this interpretation that you're pushing forward is basically the dethroning of the decentralization, if you will, the removal of humanity of that throne and bringing it back to sort of an animist perspective, if you will, where
Yes,
we are kind of in the same level playing field with
that's right.
all the other living organisms
That's
on
right.
the
Exactly.
planet.
Exactly.
So it's like a return to animism in a way, if you will.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and that's why people like to, they tend to, post-humanists tend to speak, I would say, nostalgically, let's put it that way, about pre-modern worlds and other cultures, right? Because it is true that this kind of fixation on the human is very much a kind of Abrahamic thing, and of course, the Abrahamic cultures are a minority of the world's cultures. Most cultures are not Abrahamic, and most cultures, it is true, most cultures think about humans at the same level as they think about other forms of life. I think that would be more the norm on planet Earth, right? In terms of the cultural norm, it is actually closer to a kind of post-humanist perspective.
Yeah,
So all of that is
Buddhism,
true.
Hinduism, Shintoism, they're all kind of like
Exactly.
of that.
Exactly. And I do sometimes think that part of the problem that the West has, let's say, in trying to come to terms with a culture like China, has to do with a failure to appreciate this. But that's another discussion to be had about the geopolitical implications of this, given that the parts of the world that are now really emerging and coming on the scene are not part of the Abrahamic culture, right? I mean, we're getting a kind of a shift in the balance of power that is moving away from an Abrahamic center of gravity, and so not surprisingly, a lot of the characteristic Abrahamic political doctrines, like the human rights doctrine, is now under incredible pressure. Okay, but again, that's probably another kind of discussion. But
Yes,
I think the point about the posthumanist is I would even go so far as to say that it even what it is decentering from an ontological standpoint, very much in the way you described. But I do think there's a kind of moral judgment being made as well about human beings as they have conducted themselves up to this point. Okay,
absolutely.
and that basically we have done a really bad job, and that in fact, rather than just carrying on with science and technology, we need to roll back, scale back, and this is where this image of the Anthropocene that I mentioned earlier is a really pivotal notion, I think, for the posthumanists these days. So this is the idea that since, let's say, the Industrial Revolution, end of the 18th century, right, where you start to get a sharp spike in carbon emissions that does not go down but just keeps on going up, that this is the point where humans, for the first time in geological time, right, a single species, the human, is actually primarily responsible for climate change as it happens. Okay, and this is why it's called the Anthropocene. Um, and so what you end up getting, if you take this view seriously, and this is the kind of thing that gets invoked when one says we only have 50 years or something to lower our carbon emissions, otherwise, the planet is going to, is going to somehow go into meltdown, and we're going to lose several billion people, and half the species will be gone, and all of this kind of stuff.
Not half, more like 95% actually.
That's right. That's right. No, no, that's exactly right. And I think the posthumanists take this very seriously. They take it as a damning indictment of human beings. And in fact, the point is that this is not going to be solved by more science and technology. Okay, and in fact, they find it quite damning, insulting. I don't know what, almost blasphemous that you get a lot of transhumanists like guys like Elon Musk, but this is also true of the cosmos from the 19th century onward, thinking that the cosmos, humans belong in the cosmos, right? So in a sense, the Earth is just the cradle, right? The Earth is just the beginning, and so the point is, don't fixate on it so much, right? That would be one way to read the kind of climate change problem. So in other words, you could be somebody like Elon Musk as a transhumanist, and you could say, okay, yeah, the planet might go into meltdown in 50 years time, but then look, we've got the rest of the cosmos to play around with, right? And we can go up there and we can make a new start. We can make a new start and learn from our mistakes and have a kind of new experiment in the human condition, multiple experiments, because we can colonize all over the place. And so posthumanists find this incredibly insulting to nature, even blasphemous, right? That transhumanists have this kind of hubris, right, of thinking, hell, we could leave the Earth, we could go into the cosmos, no problem. You see, so I do think there's a kind of moral judgment here that's also being made.
Absolutely, and I have to put forward my personal biases and sort of my personal journey here, because I very much started as a transhumanist, and now I find myself kind of at the edge between what you describe as posthumanism and transhumanism. And one of the things, and I don't share either of those views completely, so I'm kind of like in the border and with one foot here and one foot there. And let me just give you my version
Sure.
of what like really annoys me with some transhumanists, for example, is that the idea is like, okay, we're going to exterminate 95% of all the species. And the answer is, don't worry, we're going to de-extinct them. Yeah,
Exactly, George Church. Yeah,
so we can do whatever the heck we want. Here's the problem with that kind of thinking, and you tell me, because you're a sociologist, if
yeah, yeah.
my counter argument is making any sense to you. Take the woolly mammoth, for example, right? The idea is, look, we're going to go get some DNA, which, by the way, people have no idea how complicated that is and how, unclean or contaminated that DNA is. Because when you find the sample after, so many thousands of years, you have to actually do a number of actual guesses of like what's the DNA of the woolly mammoth and what's the DNA of like an organism that was eating that, and blah blah blah. Anyway, let's say you even get that right 100%, which is unlikely, but let's say you do. and let's say you have 100% the full genome of the woolly mammoth, which is, as I said, unlikely, but let's say you do that. You then take an embryo of a woolly mammoth and you implant it into an elephant to give birth to that woolly mammoth. And then that elephant gives birth to a woolly mammoth. And people say, look, we brought the woolly mammoth back. And my answer to that is bullshit. That baby mammoth has absolutely nothing to do and is never going to be a mammoth. Why? Because it's not only the genes that carry the woolly mammothness, if you will, but it's actually the whole culture of being a woolly mammoth, which involves being giving birth by a woolly mammoth family, growing up and being taught the sort of the woolly mammoth way, if you will. So there's a whole culture and structure. And we know the elephants are so smart and they have their own culture and they take care of their dead and they even mourn and all those things, right? And so you can genetically give birth to them, but they're never going to be the woolly mammoth of history. They're just going to be a woolly mammoth looking elephant, which was born in a zoo. Just like, once you take an animal out of the wild and or if it's born in a zoo, then you can't like release them in a wild because they can't fend for themselves. And that's particularly true of smart animals like the mammals, like orca whales, dolphins, or apes, right? If they didn't grow up in a sort of a family of apes in the Congo or something, and they were never socialized in what actually being ape means and how to survive in the world as an ape or as an orca or as a dolphin, being born in a zoo and being genetically an ape is not necessarily being the actual ape as those real apes are in the wild. So that's my counter argument. And to me, people who say, oh, we'll just de-extinct them, they grossly underplay the importance of the sociological part of being a certain species, right?
This
Because
is
it's
true.
not just about the genes.
Yep, this is certainly true. But as you were just describing, right, this problem in a way begins much earlier on than with the issue of de-extinction, right? The way you've described it, the problem already begins by having animals being born in zoos, okay, and we've been doing that for a few hundred years now, and so I'm just kind of wondering whether you're sort of in a way you're complaining about something much more than you think you are, right? So in other words, you no, right, so you're not just complaining about de-extinction, you're sort of complaining maybe even about domestication, right? I mean, that in a sense you're making a kind of absolute defense of wildness, right? That
In many ways, yes, you got that right, because I've been vegan now for 4 years.
okay,
And
okay.
so, absolutely, that kind of goes with sort of my ideological journey, if you will, right? So yes, and that's in keeping, and that's where the normative sort of judgment comes in that you kind of so well identified in sort of post-humanism, right? And so
Yeah.
that's why I sympathize with transhumanism in so many ways, and yet I tend to not underplay the damage that we have done so far, as I believe in so many cases transhumanists do.
Okay, let me ask you just one other question about this. So let's say I defend the extinction, right?
Sure,
And I've heard your argument. Um, I think part of what informs the sort of mentality that would do de-extinction isn't simply, though I know it does sound like they're trying to resurrect dead species, and in a sense, we could have all the species that have ever lived all over again, kind of thing. I know it does sound a bit like that's what they're saying, but I do think that from a biological standpoint, though, one of the things that we have to grant, and I think you would need to grant this too, is that animals are not static. Okay, right?
sure,
There's a sense in which even during the period that the woolly mammoth lived, right, it didn't remain constant. I mean, because so in other words, the different circumstances under which different woolly mammoths were brought into the world over the millions of years they were around,
sure.
right? They changed. They were different, right?
Of course. And you have subspecies in Canada and North America and in
Exactly.
Siberia. Sure.
And they all have their own cultures and all this stuff that you were just describing.
Of
Now,
course.
Now, from that standpoint, okay, so now from that standpoint, if we accept that as kind of a basic fact about the way evolution works,
Yeah.
then what de-extinction, in a way, de-extinction perhaps is falsely advertising itself as somehow resurrecting dead species. But what it's
Precisely my
doing,
point.
okay, but instead of what it's doing, it's bringing into the world new species.
Exactly. But it's not the
All
old
right.
species. So
No, but is there a problem with that? Is there a problem? My point is there a problem with that if that's what they're doing?
well, the problem with that is there to the extent that you're claiming you're bringing back the old species, right?
Okay,
So
but the
if
point is you
you're
really
not
never
going to
can
bring a
bring
new
back the old
species of
species.
woolly mammoth into the 21st century, then fine. You can make that claim, and then we can debate whether that's a worthwhile task to accomplish. But if you say, "Oh, I'm going to bring the passenger pigeon," or "I'm going to bring the woolly mammoth," you can't because you need a whole herd of woolly mammoths that
Yeah,
train
yeah, I
and the
know.
whole sociology that comes with that.
But it may be that again, again, we're talking a bit in the future here because I don't think our DNA analysis of this stuff is quite so great yet. But it may be that some aspects of the DNA of, let's say, the woolly mammoth um, are have certain kind of properties that if we could reproduce, okay, in some hybrid creature, would be worth would be worth having now. Okay, and so in a sense, what we will have done is we will have brought back to life a creature that has a substantial overlap of the DNA of the woolly mammoth, especially in the distinctive parts, but would be a different species. Okay,
Sure, and you can
uh,
make that argument. Yeah.
okay. Would you have an objection to it? That's my point. Would you
Oh,
object to it
well,
if that were the
not a
grounds for doing
principled one. I don't have
it?
a
Okay, okay.
principled objection. It will be sort of more of a on a case by case
Mhm.
basis, right? What's the cost benefit analysis, particularly to expend resources
Okay,
on this,
okay, okay. No,
right?
no, no. That's good to know because but I do think you have brought up an interesting point about the way in which the false advertising of this, ends up really kind of making making the moral situation worse than it really is.
But that's precisely one of my big concerns is that, we, or not, I don't want to say we, but many transhumanists have, because I don't count myself in that group, but they have this kind of laissez faire attitude that
Yes.
basically we have a blank check. We
Yeah.
can simply take a DNA sample, kill all living members of a particular species, and, in
Yeah.
some vague part of the future, of our glorious future, the gods that we would become would generously give back life to those animals who are not around only because our own folly. And so, first, that's problematic at least on two levels. First, that's not true, factually, because that species would be extinct for me based on the argument I made. But secondly, uh, that kind of done at a large enough macro scale can bring on about our own demise because we kind of fail to understand how we fit within that hope and how codependent we are on those other species. And if we fail to reach godhood early enough, but we extinct all the other species, we may actually fail to reach our transhuman potential precisely because we are so blindly arrogant in destroying the world around us, all the species on which we depend.
Yes, yes, yeah. I could see that. I mean, I think that it's at this point that transhuman. This is when the transhumanist argument for having multiple paths moving simultaneously. So in other words, we got the people taking care of the earth, along the lines that you're talking about. But then we might have the Elon Musks and all his friends, right, taking a handful of DNA, right, and traveling around on spaceships and setting up new colonies where, in a sense, the ecosystem becomes radically different. And so, whatever codependencies that these humans of the future will have, it will be a radically different one that we will, to a large extent, constructed from scratch, right?
Right.
Because you right, and so the point here is that transhumanists, this is why transhumanists sometimes talk about speciation, right? That the humans will become different species. Some will be very much codependent in the way you're talking about with the situation on Earth, and they will remain pretty much Homo sapiens. But then there'll be all these other species floating around and doing different things in different places. And transhumanism takes a liberal attitude on that.
Right, but here's the problem with that too. So I'm for and against, and so the devil is in the details. So here's the problem. So first of all, Elon is greatly overselling it. Okay, so saying that uh, uh, colonizing Mars is a solution of overpopulation on our planet is utterly ridiculous. Like anyone who knows about the costs of sending here one or two people to Mars, you know,
Let alone 1 or 2 billion.
let alone billions of people, that's utterly ridiculous statement saying that it's a solution to overpopulation.
He's going to tell you economies of scale.
Right, right. So
Right,
that's
it
not.
costs a lot that it costs a lot to bring up 1 or 2 to Mars, but once you got that figured out, 1 or 2 billion, easy.
I don't think the physics works in his favor. So that's one problem with Elon. Secondly, how it's done, I think it could be done, and I'm all for that. So for some adventurers like Elon to go there, right? And so we can give them certain support, but also they need to grant certain kind of taxation to us. So, for
Ah,
example, if you're Elon Musk, you cannot simply fly away and take away all your money with your wealth, or leave it here as an investment on Earth. Once you decide to go on that colony, we need to do something like, I think, a 50% tax rate or something like that, and have some kind of an arrangement with you, because you have to acknowledge in some kind of material way the debt that Earth has given to you in terms of the possibility and the chance to explore Mars. And so, provided we meet those conditions, I'm totally okay for letting adventurers like Elon Musk go and populate the universe, as long as they don't oversell that to the general population, and as long as they meet certain conditions about not sort of destroying or taking away all their wealth with them, right?
well,
Because
look, I mean, I think you're going to get that wish if he ever does, really try to colonize the cosmos. I think you will get that wish because, as far as I know, Bitcoin only works on Earth. Okay, so the point is, there's going to have to be some kind of financial arrangement still with Earth, insofar as Earth will have the only banking system, at least for a while. That this will be an opportunity for you to set up some kind of negotiated settlement. Because I can't. What would it mean for Elon Musk to take all his wealth to Mars?
well,
What do you do with it? You
well,
can't
for
do anything with
example,
it.
if it's in Bitcoin, you can take it with you even in death, supposedly, right? Because it's a
But what do you do? But what do you do with it? This is the point. What do you do with it on Mars?
well, you invest it in the new colony with new settlers or whatever. You create a new economy, and you need capital
So
to
right.
start
So
an
he better put.
industry.
He's going to need to bring some bankers on a spaceship then. Okay, because so far the banking system's on Earth. No, I mean, and all the the Bitcoin stuff is happening on Earth too. I mean, I'm
But if
just saying
you
it's a
go
practical
automate
point.
it, you don't need bankers. You need computers. You basically need a decentralized system that is the backbone of that shared trust.
But who is he trading with? Who is Elon Musk trading with when he moves to Mars?
Well,
Right.
those
This
are
is the point.
Sure, those are all good questions, and it's not going to happen, at once. Just like when the Europeans came to the New World, in the beginning there were a few outposts, and it was hard to trade and all that stuff, but eventually it picked up, right?
Oh no, you're right. But the point is, I'm just saying, I'm agreeing with you. I actually think that he will be forced into the kind of discussion that you want to have about his wealth, because he's not going to be able to just start up a whole new banking system from scratch and take all his wealth there and do something with it.
Right, and
That's
I'm
not
sure
going to happen.
he would have still investments in his, Tesla factories or battery factories or what may have you still here when he flies over there. So, anyway, but we're running out of time, so let's get back to the
Okay,
topic here. So
that's right.
we covered a lot of stuff here. So let me just ask you quickly, and maybe we have 20 some minutes here. Um, I'll keep you maybe a little bit longer, but uh, what what are the greatest? Let me just ask you this: if we take the macro view, we zoom back out. What are the greatest issues that humanity is facing in this 21st century? Because
Well,
Elon Musk has a very particular view, right? According to Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Wozniak, maybe Bill Gates, even the late Dr. Stephen Hawking, they all said that AI Is that
No, that's not the problem.
right?
That's for sure not the problem. Yeah.
Okay, so what is the problem according to Steve Fuller then, and why is not AI the big problem?
Ah, well, let me tell you what I think the real problem is. The big problem is going to be the issue that we've been talking about throughout this discussion, and that is the definition and value of humanity. Okay? So, in other words, I do see, first of all, that this distinction between the trans and post-humanists is going to have greater and greater salience in the political arena. And that's going to boil down to the extent to which we really do value human beings and what it is that we value about them. And I think there's a lot of questions that are already being opened up about this. And so one of the things that we've only kind of skirted around, which I think is part of this discussion, is the value of humans vis-a-vis other animals. And as you and part of the environmental movement and the animal rights movement, right, which is very much broadly speaking part of this kind of post-humanist trajectory, um, really are I don't want to say that they are anti-human. I think that might be a little bit strong,
I
but I
agree.
do think that there are a lot of people, especially I would say of the younger generation, who, in a sense, if you look at what their primary modes of affiliation are, in other words, what is it that you relate to the most, right? It seems to me you got two kinds of answers that are on horizon, which are really quite different from each other. One of them is animals, right, and nature, and that they relate to that, right, more than they do other human beings. That's one thing. And the other thing, of course, is the whole cyberspace thing. Okay, that people relate to stuff happening online, and they're not really too fussed about whether the originators of the stuff happening online are human or not human or whatever, right? As long as they get some kind of meaningful interaction out of it. Okay, and it seems to me that these two things are as kind of ways in which people are spending their time, affiliating, establishing their identities and stuff like that. They are really challenging very core a kind of coherent sense of what it is to be a human being. Okay, because I don't think we could take for granted anymore, and we're going to be able to take it even less for granted in the future, that people's primary modes of affiliation are with other human beings. Okay, and this is a problem. This is a problem, right? I mean, and trans and post-humanism are right in the middle of this.
I agree with you completely, I have to say, because and that was kind of the original question behind me starting my blog 10 years ago. What is the meaning of being human, and how is that being changed? How the question, even, and let alone the answer, is being changed in the context of all those changes that we're undergoing right now. So that's one thing. Uh, so I agree with you, and that's where again that distinction you draw is important, because many people would be questioning that starting presumption, that teleological presumption about the unique special position that humanity takes on that normative scale with
Yeah,
respect to all
yeah.
other life. And as long as people fail to embrace that starting position, they would be against it, or they would be questioning it, and there will be conflict on that level. And as I said, I myself kind of struggled. I'm kind of like half and half, if you will. So I don't even know where exactly I am, because I embrace different elements of each, but I struggle with that.
And you see, the thing is, what is really striking to me is that this kind of issue that we're talking about now, I think it is there is a real generational thing about this, because I think young people get it. Okay, they get that, they see, like, for example, their intuitions about human beings are not as secure as they were, let's say, in the post-war era. Okay, and so, and there, and in my own classrooms, I have students. Some of them are driven toward the environmental movement, to animals, and all this kind of stuff. And sometimes you will hear them say some very derogatory things about human beings. Like it'd be better if if half the population disappeared or something. I mean, they're not taking any action to do that, but the fact that this kind of view can actually get some voicing is kind of interesting. And then there are other people who, again, they're living their entire lives in cyberspace, and they have quite. See, this is, by the way, this in talking about this side of the issue, I want to address the artificial intelligence issue too,
Please, I
because
was
I
going
think,
to ask you about that, because you said
yeah,
not the major issue.
No,
So
it isn't, and I think it's kind of beside the. I mean, to be honest with you, I think this is a self-created transhumanist bubble. This fear of artificial intelligence taking over the world. I think it. I mean, for people like Bostrom and the Future of Humanity Institute, which gets a lot of money. The Center for Existential Risk. It's Cambridge, right? They get a lot of money from a lot of guilty guys in the IT industry, right, who are worried that they're in fact creating the conditions under which the world's going to end. I mean, I think that's kind of where all this stuff is coming from, right? Um, the reason why I'm not so worried about this is, first of all, I don't think it's going to happen quite as fast as people say. I think in a sense, the sense of possible imminent doom really rides a lot on thinking that the
Breaker 12
computational.
timeline. He
Exactly.
basically says
I think
9
it
years from now.
presupposes.
9 years
Yeah. Well,
from
see,
now, we should have a human level AI, and by 2045, which is only about 26 years from now, we should have the singularity. So,
I know, and and while I don't, so let me make myself clear on this. While I do believe that the direction of travel is that way, I don't believe it will happen so fast, and that is an important point because by not happening so fast, that gives us time to think about it and to deal with it in various ways, right? And I want and the way I think about this that I think really
soft
changes the whole.
takeoff.
Yeah. I mean, soft takeoff. That's a good way of putting it. But I think there's that one of the consequences of having a soft takeoff um, is that the distinction that is presupposed in this apocalyptic scenario of us versus them, humans versus AI. I don't think that's going to apply. Why? Because of cyborganization. I mean, it seems to me that this whole line of apocalyptic thinking really presupposes a kind of really undifferentiated view of humans and AI, right? They're these two radically different things that in some sense are alien to each other. But of course, what we are increasingly seeing, and this is what I would have thought Stephen Hawking would have figured out, right, is that they're mixing together. I mean, Stephen Hawking was 75% machine when he died, and the point is cyborganization. Well, seriously, whose side is he on? I mean, the thing is, cyborganization, right, is in fact getting to be more and more the norm. And this raises a different kind of question, which is nevertheless very interesting, and that is the idea of identity. Who do you identify with? So supposing we do get to a situation, let's say 100 years from now, right, where there is some runaway AI doing something crazy, it would seem to me that by that time, there would be quite a lot of people who will already have become integrated into the kind of AI world in a very material kind of way. They will have been cyborgs. They'll be like those, those later episodes of Star Trek, right, where the creatures on board are kind of a mix of lots of different things. I mean, I do think this is kind of more the world we're heading into. In which case, then where's the them and the us in all this?
But let me give you a counter example, and they're very important historical examples here. Okay, I hear your point, but I believe if you look at the history of ethnic cleansing,
Mm.
it's every single time it's been fabricated. So, for example, I come from the Eastern Bloc, from Bulgaria, and if you look at the wars in the collapse of Yugoslavia, and I read a bunch of books, and because that was kind of like my specialty in school, my master's thesis and all of that. And you would have people who lived through the horrors of the war there, and you would have someone who would tell you something like, "I was a, um, uh, what did he say? He said, before the war, I didn't know I'm a Muslim, right? So in Yugoslavia, you had all kinds of intermixed marriages between Muslims and Christians. No one paid attention who was Croat and who was Serb, who was Muslim. You had mixed marriages between Muslims and Serbs and Croats and all of those. And then after when the atrocity started happening, suddenly that kind of identity got fabricated. So it was more fabricated than real, and yet
Uh-huh.
did not stop this kind of ethnic cleansing happening. So before the war, people would say, I didn't know I'm a Muslim, and then suddenly I discovered. And same situation happened, by the way, in Rwanda. In Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus were kind of a fabrication of the French colonizer. of the French colonial government. And the main distinction was not genetic, but rather ones were farmers, and the others were herders. So the distinction was, one dealt with like farming, on tilling the land, and the other group was basically herding animals. That was the main distinction between Tutsis and Hutus. Not so much genetic or tribal one, right? It was more about occupation, and then the French kind of artificially created this sort of on the principle of divide to rule, and all
Yeah.
that stuff. And yet that was then used, that fabricated identity was so deeply embraced so quickly that it led to this kind of ethnic cleansing. So I get what you're saying, but yet I think that may be insufficient to prevent that kind
So
of.
I see. So there is a sense in which, when we reach this point where the apocalypse is about to happen, that as it were, these older notions of I'm really a human, right, will become more important.
Well, no, but I'm just saying that the new identities that could emerge at that time, which we may not be able to foresee right now, could be divisive enough and polarizing enough to give rise to that kind of level of violence, is what I'm
I
trying to
see.
say. And I
I
don't know
see. I
along
see.
what categories
Oh, I
that
see what you're
that
saying.
that crevice would emerge, but I'm just
I
saying the
see.
potential of
Mhm.
creating a crevice is there, and
I see.
some agent or other exploiting it, creating it artificially, and then exploiting it for other reasons, right?
Okay,
Just
that's
like
interesting.
Milosevic did in Yugoslavia, for example.
I see. I see. I see. So yeah, so this is going to have to be the thing that Bostrom writes in his next book about superintelligence, right? You have to bring in a new agent, right? This diabolical agent that that messes with the situation once it arises.
Right. And my
But it's not quite as elegant as the paperclip stuff.
my candidate for that agent, by the way, is humanity.
Hmm,
That's my candidate, because I think we have still the monopoly of good and evil, and I am very much of the claim that technology is not enough. That especially at the outset, AI, if it even comes to be, would be greatly influenced and impacted by our own narrative, and whether it comes to be in a military context, in a commercial context, or some other context, would greatly impact the direction of that, and then that would have certain implications. But anyway, let's go back to,
okay.
we have probably a few minutes left, like 10 or 15 minutes. Let me see, where does this book of yours, the latest book that I just finished reading, fit here within this discussion, which is called, by the way, Nietzschean Meditations, Untimely Thoughts at the Dawn of the Transhuman Age. So first of all, when is the book coming out?
Sometime, I guess, the end of this year. I'm looking through proofs now, so it's going to be advertised in the Frankfurt Book Fair during the autumn. So I
Mhm.
guess the end of this year.
Okay. And where does this book fit within this conversation then?
Okay. Well, let's put it this way. I think what this book is about. I mean, and this is one of the reasons why I invoke Nietzsche as a kind of an icon for this. It's about, as it were, what are the existential issues that face a transhumanist if you take these ideas seriously. Okay. So I talk about a lot of things in the book that I think transhumanists very often don't want to talk about, and I think we've touched on some of these here. Um, so for example, I put a lot of emphasis on the morphological freedom argument, right? So in other words, and morphological freedom is, in a way, a kind of two-edged sword with regard to transhumanism, because on the one hand, I see it very much, and I think a lot of the transhumanists would agree on this point, that in a sense it can be seen as very much part of the sort of expansive mentality that's been associated with liberalism in the modern era, right? And where liberalism is understood as being released from your origins, right? So it doesn't matter who your parents are, it doesn't matter what race you are, right? I mean, a lot of these things where in the past people were judged by their origins, and this held them back and made it difficult for them to do anything in life other than what their parents did. Okay,
Right.
that gradually the history of
Biology is no
liberalism.
longer going to be destiny.
Right, and neither is class origin, and neither anything that has a kind of origin story built into it.
Yeah.
Those things have been largely deconstructed during the modern era, and it's normally seen to be part of liberalization.
Yeah.
And so transhumanism, the morphological freedom idea, um, belongs in this category as well. So, for example, you could perhaps be a human being, uh, or an entity could be a human being without having been born a human being. Let's put it that way, right? So AI is not born a human being, but could qualify to be a human being, right? So this would be, as it were, taking that morphological freedom argument down the path of liberalism, to the logical conclusion. And I'm very supportive of this kind of idea in the book. But it does, as it were, stretch at the limits of liberalism, okay? Because historically, liberalism has presupposed that one of the things about that, as it were, first of all, the variation among people isn't that great. And that things like gender differences and race differences and class differences, in some way they balance out, right? That people need each other, they're reciprocal relationships between people, and this justifies a division of labor in society. And what it does is it reinforces a kind of general metaphysical idea of natural equality, because no one's self-sufficient, right? Everyone needs everyone else for something. Okay, I
Yeah.
mean, and this has always been part of the liberal mentality, and you see this with John Locke, with Adam Smith, with all these people, and so this was often called natural equality, right? So natural equality is not that we all have the same qualities, but rather, in a sense, we're all equally dependent on each other. Almost, it's more like that argument. But you see, if you really take some of the transhumanist imaginaries in a very strong way, like being able to upload your mind and be able to have access to all the knowledge on the internet and all the rest of it, then you do get to, and some transhumanists do talk this way about living in a self-sufficient world, right? A world, and this is where all this issue about speciation being tolerated and all of that stuff. And so, in that regard, then it really changes the whole look of morphological freedom. Okay, and you end up getting a complete dissolution of the human. Right? It just kind of explodes into these many different things, like shrapnel. Okay, and I do worry there is very much this tension within transhumanism, which we will have to come to grips with politically in the not too distant future. I think so. That's one issue. The other issue that is big in the book that we haven't really talked about here, because we haven't talked too much about the biological side of transhumanism, namely this issue about pushing longevity forever. And the way I talk about it in the book, which is very much uncharacteristic of the way transhumanists normally talk about this, is I don't presuppose that just because you can live forever, if you can, that you should live forever. Okay, so in other words, the final chapter of the book is called "Death as a Lifestyle Choice in Transhumanism." And so, with the book,
Right.
go
So
ahead.
I have had this argument with some notable transhumanists, more recently, lastly, with Gennady Stulyarov II, um, who basically said uh, death is wrong and life is right, and that's it, right? And that's why we should live forever, basically. And to me, that sounds a very circular argument,
Well,
like
sure.
saying, I am the king and you're the subjects, and the reason is because I'm the king and you're the subjects. It's like this kind of circular,
Yeah.
or I am a rich and you're a poor guy, or like I am smart and you're or like any other kind of ridiculous circular. And to me, you have to bring some kind of outside utility if you were to claim that your argument holds any merit in terms of any value, right? Rather than just having this circularity. So am I like? Do you agree with me or do you disagree?
I do agree with you on that point. I mean, I also think that this fixation on living forever, in a way, I'm afraid, reflects the parochialism of a lot of transhumanism, because it is transhumanists seem to be under the supposition, and the gentleman you were referring to seems to have this idea that if you can live forever, who wouldn't want to live forever,
Right.
right? Whereas there's absolutely no evidence that most people want to live forever, right? So in other words, this would be a hard sell, okay, even if it were possible.
But
If you really,
not only that, but what's the value of living to have
no,
it living to have it ongoing forever, right? So first of all, like let's examine this historically. So let's say you're Hitler. Do I want Hitler to live forever? Clearly, and I'm sure they would say no, right? So
Unless you could put him in prison forever.
right, but then what's the point? What's the
Well,
point?
because then, oh well, excuse me. No. Again, let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure,
If you
sure.
believe, so if you believe that Hitler's like the most awful person in human history, right? It would be good as a kind of symbolic reminder to have that guy there locked up, right? So you say, there, in other words, you got the moment there, right? You could celebrate the moment. See, we got the worst guy in history, and he's locked up forever, and we can look at him and see, you're the worst guy in history. I
Right.
actually think, given our attitudes toward Hitler in particular, there could be some, kind of symbolic moral value in keeping that guy around behind bars, right? Not allowing him to die, not allowing him to die.
Right, right. As a sort of like eternal the punishment, if you will.
Yes, exactly. I mean, from the
Forever.
Greek mythology. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is
Right.
the thing. Who is the? Is it
Prometheus.
Prometheus?
Yeah, but
Prometheus.
but
Yeah.
but Hercules saves him eventually, right? Hercules goes and breaks the chains, and Prometheus gets free, and all of that. But so to me, whether it's worth extending something, you have to first demonstrate some value of that something in its own right, and only then you can put the
Yeah.
argument. Therefore, it's worth extending it. So I have to ask, as an ethicist with a Socratic background, okay, what is life good for? What are you planning to use your life for? How are you using it? Because one of the things that I've noticed is many people have no idea in the transhumanist community and in general how to use their life to begin with. And then their argument is like, well, if I have 1,000 years instead of 100 years, I'll figure it out. Well, I'm not so sure, because you have to figure it out. You have to actually first start looking for that answer. You have to ask the question, and many people are not asking the question because they give this
No, you're
simple
absolutely right.
argument: is like, oh, life is right and death is wrong, period.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're absolutely right on this point, and I am a little mystified, especially when you do hear the transhumanists give answers about what would you do with eternal life, and it sounds like they would just be going on a constant holiday, right? I mean, it's kind of what it looks like, or when they start thinking about it a little bit more, it becomes a reason why not to have children, because all the stuff that in the past you would invest in your children is hopes the things they might do that you could not do in your life, you would now have the time to do them yourself, right?
Right.
So you don't have to worry about kids, as it were, fulfilling your dreams or anything like that. You see, so I mean, and so the more they talk about it, the worse it sounds.
But let me make this even more personal here, because we're having such a great conversation. What about you? Because I personally am giving this counter argument, but of course, self-servingly, I am, if I had the chance, of course, I would self-servingly embrace, not in all situation, but in most situation, extended longevity. Right? Where do you stand on that? Would you embrace it, and under what conditions you would or you wouldn't embrace it?
Well, I mean, I have thought about this, and first point I would make is that from a sociological standpoint, it is people, the so-called, and maybe my guess is you are younger than me, but the thing is that we're probably enough in the same age group to be called middle youth. Middle youth, typically,
43.
typically males. They are the ones who most want to live forever, right? People who are healthy, right? Who
Yeah.
People who are like getting, who recognize that they are getting more years on them, and so as it were, society start, they're thinking, okay, society thinking, I'm getting close to the end here and all that, but I
Yeah.
feel I'm just beginning, right? I mean, if you have that kind of attitude toward life, which I have, for example,
Yeah.
and then the whole idea of having more time, you know, makes perfect sense, right? I mean, and so I do think it appeals to a certain kind of person intuitively, but only to that kind of person. Because if you've had a life where you're just doing a lot of awful stuff in terms of your job and all the rest of it, you just want peace. You want out of here. I mean, there are a lot of people who, in a sense, or feel I've done what I can. And so I want to address that part of it in terms of me personally. I've done what I can, because I think that there's a sense in which that's kind of where my thinking focuses on. Now, as someone whose life is intellectual in the broad sense, I spent a lot of time writing and communicating, and like I'm doing here, and teaching and all that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, what you're doing when you're doing that kind of stuff that I do is, in a sense, you're engaged, especially when you're writing, you're engaged in a kind of self-codification. You're self-codifying, right? And I've always thought about this, uh, and I think a lot of people who do spend their life writing think what they're doing this way as a kind of preparing a legacy, right? So, in other words, you are expecting to die. And part of what you're doing when you're living is laying the groundwork for others to come in the future. And so, this is why you actually spend quite a lot of time trying to get your thoughts straight and writing them down, right? And leaving them somewhere where people will read them, right? And have some kind of impact on others, right? You really wouldn't be doing that if you thought you were going to be around forever, constantly communicating yourself,
Yeah,
right?
but
And
Woody Allen's response to that line of reasoning is, I don't want to be immortal through my work. I want to be immortal through not dying.
okay, but this is different for me. I'm a kind of open-minded guy on this. Okay, I mean, I actually do feel that I have a lot more to say and all the rest of it, but I am very well aware because look, I mean, the bottom line is if you spend most of your time writing, you're doing kind of what I'm doing here. I'm in an office all day. I've got the shades down. It's summer, right? I mean, I go running every day and I do a lot of traveling and all that kind of stuff. But most of all that stuff that I'm doing is channeled toward this stuff of doing all this writing, which is just basically preparing a legacy, right? And so there is a sense in which if one wants to be a bit kind of detached about it, about how I live my life, right? It is a kind of preparation for death, right? And I think this is true of sort of intellectuals more generally. And I don't think you have to even be particularly controversial to be engaged in this kind of mode because the kind of living you're doing is really quite restricted and focused in that way.
And let me bring here the last three or four questions here, but it makes a good transition because I wanted to ask you about the relevance and importance of philosophy in general and ethics in particular. And what you're talking here about brings, of course, what Socrates said in the Apology, I think, where he said that philosophy was basically preparing for death. That's what
Yeah.
philosophy was
Well,
all about.
yeah. I mean, in the book, in this Nietzschean Meditations book, I actually, spend a bit of time talking about the Stoics and
I
the
love the
Stoic
Stoics.
movement. Yeah, because the Stoics, I think, got it right. I mean, I think that in a sense they got it. And I would wish that transhumanism kind of adopted this kind of standpoint, and then would be able to take a much more responsible attitude toward the question of death. Right, where in a sense, at the end of the day, if you've done what you think you can do, and you have the choice to live or die, there's nothing compelling you to live, right? That you have done what you can do. And so a perfect kind of completion to your life would be to take your life in suicide. Okay. And I realize that this is a very taboo subject in the sort of world we're living in now. But I think a large part of that has to do with the fact that, death is involuntary in a sense that, but if you're able to live forever, right, then death automatically becomes voluntary and you could exercise it and it could be seen as the ultimate kind of freedom, right? Because you're basically voluntarily stopping the default position, right?
Also,
In a
you
very
can just
radical
do
way.
what's called deadheading. You can be dead for a couple hundred centuries or a couple thousand years, whatever, and then come back, be brought back with cryonics and stuff like that. But of course, the transhumanists would call us both here old-fashioned deathists because both of us have a very kind of a lot more open-ended
Yeah.
view of death and the sort of the avoidance of it, whereas they would say under no conditions. And that's like one thing that always kind of has pushed me away a little bit from transhumanists is that they don't see any circumstances in many cases where death would be warranted, whereas I see many circumstances in which I would prefer to be dead or to die for a reason or a cause or what have you, in a certain situation, whereas they don't see any kind such possibility.
Well, I mean, I do think, one of the things I do talk about in the book about, as it were, systemic advantages of dying. Okay. So, that is to say, advantages that don't accrue to you personally, but may accrue to humanity as a whole, um, is this issue about how does radical change happen, right? Radical intellectual, cultural change. And a lot of it has to do with generational change in the very specific sense that you basically have a new bunch of people coming into being who are not saddled with the memories of the older people, right? The older people all go through life having, and especially in the way the transhumanists are thinking about it, because, right, one of the target diseases, perhaps the biggest target disease of the transhumanist biomedical imaginary is Alzheimer's, right? We're going to have perfect memories forever, right? We're not going to only live forever, we're going to remember everything. Now, that is a complete nightmare from the standpoint of any kind of radical change. Because, in fact, where radical change comes from is the fact that you have a new generation of people who aren't invested. They don't have the old memories. They're not invested in the past in any kind of way. Their understanding of the past is purely through secondary, tertiary media, right? So they have their own opportunities because of the mediated way they relate to the past to actually reinterpret the past. And
And that
sometimes,
gives
as it
them
were,
a new point of view, which brings progress.
exactly,
Yeah, that's
exactly,
yes, I totally agree with you. I love that. I
exactly.
totally agree with you because actually forgetting serves a very important function, and that actually
Yes,
is true in the personal. At the personal level, because let's say you're in the middle of some kind of a clash or argument, and you remember all these things and facts, and you want to win, and you're angry, and this and that, and then 10, 20 years later, you forget the whole thing. You remember it was a big fight, but don't remember what it was all about exactly, and therefore you're able to literally transcend, which I believe transhumanism is exactly about, your previous position, your previous biases, your previous kind of hangover with that particular outcome or point of view, and you're able to transcend it. And that's part of my disappointment with transhumanism in general, is that first I got disappointed by many notable transhumanists at the personal level, but even going beyond that, at sort of the philosophical level of my disappointment came at the level where, transhumanism is about this kind of transcending something, right? Whereas I see that many, if not most people, have taken it as an opportunity to simply re-entrench their original starting beliefs. And so if you're libertarian, you're like, oh, transhumanism is perfect, and now I'm going to be even more hardcore libertarian than I've always been. And the point in life, I think, is to have this journey, which means that you don't get stuck on point A all your life, whether intellectually or physically, but you have this journey which makes you travel away from the starting point of point A, and you transcend your current situation. And that's what transhumanism should be ideally philosophically
yes.
about.
I
But
agree
what
with you
you actually
100%.
observe in the community, at least that's my claim after doing hundreds of conversations on the topic, is that most people fail miserably on that level because they simply use transhumanism to re-entrench their libertarian or other kind of ideological points of view with which they started with. And that, to me, that was very disappointing. Do you agree with that observation? Do you think
I
that's
do agree with
false?
that observation, but that just shows that there's a lot of room for improvement in transhumanism. It's why one of the reasons why I recommend that people actually study the movement and even get involved in the movement is precisely because I do think it remains, even though it's been around now for several decades, it remains philosophically primitive. I think that would be fair. Philosophically primitive in the sense that the ideas are really, as you say, they're really either they're borrowed from the views that the transhumanists already had coming into it, or they're not very well developed. And I would say, especially with so with the ideas of morphological freedom and the idea of living forever, these are two very provocative and superficially attractive ideas, but they have all kinds of problems attached to them that transhumanists, have barely begun to address at all. So yes, I mean, so I do think it's a work in progress. Let's say that about
Right.
transhumanism.
I agree with that, and I don't hold that against transhumanism because we're all work in progress in all philosophies. But I think it's important to bring that sort of theological or epistemological perspective into transhumanism. So first, people are aware of where those ideas come from, and that comes, from cosmism very much. But even before that, as you point in your upcoming book, all the way to the Greeks and so on, if you will. Condorcet in the French
Mm.
Revolution, and so on. So, very important epistemological basis, but also the philosophical dimension, I think, is very shallow. If anything, you can say that philosophically speaking, and I wouldn't even call Ayn Rand, philosophically worthy. But the philosophical streams in transhumanism could be very much sort of libertarian and Ayn Randian, you can say, in many cases. And I would say that's a very shallow foundation to to build something like transhumanism. And there's no worse example, in my opinion, perhaps, than the transhumanist wager. And by the way, that kind of conflict that we talked about, the undervaluing or underappreciation of the theological basis for transhumanism, can very well be seen in the transhumanist wager.
Yeah, I know.
Zoltan puts a religion as the greatest enemy, and I'm an atheist, and I'm certainly not exactly a Christian. So, uh, I can give him a lot of leeway there. But going to the extremes that he goes in terms of wholesale destruction and bombing of all the world's monuments in the end and stuff like that, and sort of installing this kind of global transhumanist dictatorship for the benefit of all, just like all dictatorships, of course, are always for the benefit of all. So, like, that kind of shows shallow philosophical foundation and understanding of where the epistemology of transhumanism comes from, and underplays the benefits of those origins. Uh,
Well, I let me just say, I'm in quite a lot of communication with Sultan, and I think, and you're right in terms of that particular book, but I think Zoltan himself is a work in progress. So I
we're
wouldn't
all
quite
we're
give up.
all a work in progress, yeah. And I'm
Yeah, so I wouldn't give up hope entirely that because I have he and I have discussed a lot of this theological stuff. He and I are quite friendly.
me and
And
him too, but that
mm,
doesn't mean I don't disagree with him
no,
fundamentally.
no, no, no. But I'm just saying, I think he might be able to shift on this issue. That's
Okay.
what I'm saying.
Okay. All right. So
Mm.
Steve, we've been talking for about 2 hours and 15 minutes. Let me ask you this. Where can people find more about you and your work?
Ah. Well, I do have a website at the University of Warwick, which has a lot audio files, of my talks. I give lots of talks all over the place, and also has articles of mine, and you can see my CV with books. But people can also contact me if they want through my email s.w.fuller@warwick.ac.uk, and maybe when you post this, you could indicate that because I'm happy to deal with people who have some questions.
I'll link to your website there. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the most important thing is, and I just want to bring this to a close because I think this is a good point to end our
Mm-hmm.
conversation. And I think we have started a conversation that maybe we would have to revisit several times, hopefully in person, because I really enjoyed this. But what's the bottom line? What's the message that perhaps you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from this 2 hour and 15-minute conversation with Steve Fuller today, whether about transhumanism or in general?
Well, I do think the important thing about transhumanism, I think, regardless of where you stand on it, pro or con, is that it is probably the movement at the moment that is really calling into question in a very fundamental way what it is to be a human being. And insofar as that question still has meaning to people, then transhumanism is actually a very good way of getting engaged with that matter, because transhumanism is a very polarizing kind of philosophy. Some people take to it immediately; they kind of get it and they love it, and other people think it's completely aberrant. And I think the difference, right, will have to do with your intuitions of what you think it is to be a human being. Okay. And transhumanism takes very seriously the idea that we are progressive, right? We are progressive creatures. We are creatures, works in progress, as it were. Um, whereas and that is one obvious vision of the human from the Enlightenment, and as I say, it has a theological root. But there are other people who believe that in fact that is not the way we should be thinking about humans. We should be thinking about humans as much more embedded in the world, right? As one among many living creatures, and that we have to live with all those creatures, and that we shouldn't be, as it were, raising ourselves above them for any kind of reason, religious or otherwise. And I think this is a really important question for people to face if they are interested in what the nature of being a human being is. And so I would leave it there. That would be a good way to get into the whole transhumanist discussion.
So ask yourself, what does it mean to be human?
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, and I would say, I would just add that that's the question that Socrates asked, and the Greeks were asking back in the day, 2,500 years ago. I think it's as pertinent, if not more so, today than ever. And I would say I've actually been sort of working on and off, and I'm kind of like failing to make much progress, but I'm constantly thinking about this new book that I'm working on called Rewriting the Human Story, why our story determines our future, or how our story determines our future. And that's precisely many of the ideas here that we discussed today, that that narrative that we have, whether teleological or epistemological or metaphysical, has a direct impact on what we're going to produce as ideas of what it means to be human, right? Because the narratives tell us who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going. Whether you take the Bible, the Abrahamic religions, or whether you take, the sort of animalistic or more decentralized religions like Buddhism and so
Mm.
on, Hinduism, and that would have, and so being aware that those narratives actually set the space, or clear the space within which you can come up with answers to that question, is very important. And so if you want to change the answers, you have to start by changing the space first, which comes directly from those narratives. So you have to become aware of the narrative, teleological
Yes.
or theological or epistemological or metaphysical or otherwise, or even scientific, if you want to call it that way, cosmological, because those determine the space within which you come up with the range of solutions. And that's why I've been kind of struggling with this idea for a few years now. But anyway, our conversation now is giving me more ideas and more motivation.
Have you interviewed Yuval Harari?
Look, I met Yuval 3 or 4 years ago when he was just starting. I met him in person, and he promised he would do an interview for me. I met him at the University of Toronto. We had a conversation. He signed my book. And then I just dragged my feet for 6 or 7 months. There was some stuff that was happening, so I couldn't focus on that interview at the time. And then his star, basically, he took off like a pop star, and then it's been impossible to get him now, ever since. So I'm. It's very likely that I haven't given up completely, but it's very likely I missed my chance to get him for an interview. But he,
But he would be. But in terms of your own project,
yeah,
he would be a very useful person to have this kind of long form discussion with.
Absolutely, and he has had tremendous impact on my ideas. So absolutely, I can see that. I don't know if I'll be able to get him, let alone for such a generous long form discussion like I had with you today, because like literally one of the most wanted people around the world right now.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, Steve Fuller, thank you very much for being with us today. This was, for me personally, a very enriching conversation. I enjoyed it.
Well, it was for me too. It was for me too, and I hope the audience will like it as well. I think it was quite interesting. Yeah.
If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.